So I want to welcome Jane Chirico, who was here about a month ago to talk all things gardening. Jane is at, Guelph University,
Yeah, yeah,
and I think her bent is permaculture, and most
yeah.
would probably say, "What in the heck is permaculture?" But I just basically been looking at photos, and it's not what we traditionally use to go to
Mhm.
garden. So she's going to give us some information on that, and then the rest of the time is going to be spent answering your personal questions about gardening, anything that you have, and maybe we can share a few of our own tips.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, are you ready?
I'm ready to go. I'll
Okay,
just
you're on.
share my screen here. Thank you. Thank you for having me back, first of all. Um, so yeah, my name is Jane Chirico. Today I will be addressing permaculture, like Harriet mentioned. She also asked me to address a little bit of container gardening. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But for those of you who weren't here last time, I'll just go over permaculture quickly. So it stands for permanent agriculture. It is a regenerative and self-sufficient system, and it utilizes the space given rather than changes to or change the environment to fit itself. So it utilizes mostly perennial plants. Um, so it comes back every year. It's often a small scale practice. And permaculture also really values community learning and sharing within the community.
Wonderful.
Um, so there are 12 main permaculture design principles. They're all shown here. They outline the goals and the expectations of permaculture as a whole. So in the next few slides, I'm going to kind of go over how you can integrate permaculture into your own garden. And I'll kind of tie into these 12 design principles as I go along. So the first kind of tip I have would be to start small. Um, it's much more manageable and less overwhelming if you start with a small patch than do a full acre wide food forest right off the bat. Especially when you run into problems. There are fewer problems you can run into if you have a tiny little plot than you do if you have a big one. Um, Even space-wise, a lot of you probably don't have 2 acres to plant a permaculture garden. So just start with a small little bed, see what happens, see how things interact, and then you can expand from there. Um, and one of the permaculture design principles is actually to adopt small and slow solutions, especially because this is a long-term process. And again, it's much more manageable to start on a small scale. My next little tip would be to use the space that you're given. Permaculture really values working with what you have and not disturbing the pre-existing environments and ecosystems. So you really want to take into account the natural slope of the land, where the water falls, the different types of ecosystems. So whether you have a forest patch or there's grasslands, and really take notice of that and work that into your garden rather than changing it to fit what you want. Um, so designing from patterns to details is a principle you can see on the screen there. Um, and it suggests that we take a step back to observe what is already there in the environment and design from there. So that is really what I just said earlier. But it's very important when designing permaculture garden or system. Um, so when coming up with a plan on how to use your space, there are 3 more principles that kind of tie in. Catching and storing energy is really important. Um, and when I first heard that, I thought, okay, well, catching and storing solar energy, using that to power, and it's really not that complicated. Um, So energy can also involve the nutrient and soil cycles, how wild animals or even domesticated animals flow through the space, or even how people move through the space. So the main goal is to capture those energies and cycle them through the system rather than letting them kind of escape the other end. And so, yeah, letting them cycle through in as many ways as possible. So a really good example of this would be catching rainwater. I don't know if any of you have rain barrels. I hopefully will have a rain barrel soon, but it's a really easy solution. You catch water that's already there and you use it to water your garden. And so that's a really good example of taking that energy that's already flowing in and cycling it through the system rather than pumping water from somewhere else. Um, another concept or design principle that relates to this is creating no waste, as well as using renewable resources. They kind of go hand in hand. Um, so that is pretty obvious when you think of it environmentally. And I'm sure you guys have talked about this quite a bit, but you can definitely incorporate composting systems. A really easy way to return matter back to the environment is when you chop your plants down at the end of the season, as long as there's no fungus on them or anything, just put them back into the ground. You can dig them in or you can just leave them on the top. And all that decomposing nutrients will be returned into the ground and recycled rather than throwing it away and having it either sit in a landfill or decompose somewhere else. You're using those natural nutrients in your own garden.
Any questions about this so far?
Yeah, for sure.
So does that mean leaving, I have a question, does that mean leaving, I did a really bad thing. I murdered a few, what do you call those not chinch bugs.
Oh.
Oh gosh, I can't even think of it.
That's okay.
Those, they're little tiny critters that get on your leaves and they leave little holes all over the place.
Oh, okay.
I'm not talking slugs.
Earwigs?
Earwigs.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I actually murdered about maybe 50 yesterday. And how I did it was I rolled a piece of paper up and tight and put it inside the plant. And then lo and behold, when I opened it up, it's full of earwigs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, bugs are a little
Comments about
tricky.
that?
Yeah, they're a bit tricky because the bugs do lay eggs or they'll overwinter in things. So as much as I would like to say put them back in, I wouldn't. I would try and get rid of bugs as much as you can because again, they will reproduce. They're really fast at reproducing. So they'll reproduce sometimes within the same season. So if you can get rid of those, and I don't know, I don't think I would put them in a compost. I'm not super familiar with that yet, but if you can get rid of those, I would.
Okay.
I was more talking about like dead plant material that's not contaminated. That's why I mentioned fungus, because fungus will overwinter in the soil or in a bark. Its spores will overwinter and it'll come back the next year. So as long as your plant matter is pretty healthy, just stick it right back in the ground and it'll be fine.
I've noticed that when you open up, I've been getting some mulch for my garden beds, and there's been a couple of bags that have some white mold on it. I kind of try to put that on the top. Just to remove it is too difficult. So will that eventually die, that mold?
Yeah, that should be fine. Usually the types of molds that infect like decomposing wood. So the types of fungus that decompose or affect decomposing wood aren't the types of fungus that affect plants.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so there's fungus that live on dead matter, where there's fungus that lives on living matter, and it's pretty separated, so you should be fine. Especially if you put it at the top, once the sun hits it, it'll probably die.
I have a question about
Yeah.
using your dead matter. So should you take it and sort of chop it up small and leave it in a pile for a little bit and then kind of mulch it in? Or are you saying as we trim leaves or like some, I take them, put them in a bag. So should I chop them up but you want it to look nice, so you don't want them just all laying there dead. So I'm not sure how to do that.
Yeah, that's the thing is, I think a lot of people were, I guess, taught to just take them away because it doesn't look good, which is totally fair. When you put a fresh layer of mulch down, you don't want a bunch of leaves laying all over it. But there's a concept called chop and drop. So you can literally just chop your leaves off, drop them on the ground, and they'll return. You can chop them up into little pieces, but yeah, you can put them in right away. If you don't want to put them in right away and you want to wait till the fall, you can definitely put them in a pile kind of in your backyard, let them sort of decompose a little bit. And then if you want to scoop that back on in the fall, you can. But yeah, it is really a matter of whether you want to compromise looks or not. But yeah, you can kind of store them somewhere else. Store them where they'll have a little bit of airflow, so not in a plastic bag, because they'll just kind of rot and get all slimy. But if you want to store them in a pile in your backyard, that's totally fine, and then put them on in the fall.
Okay.
Hmm. That was a good question, though.
Yeah, well, we just always want it to look pretty.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Making it work well.
Yeah, for sure. That's totally understandable.
I have a garden expert friend. Her name is Bonnie Cappadocia.
Oh, yes. I've heard of her a few times.
Yeah, she composts. She does all composting and uses leaves all the time, especially maple leaves. And she uses the leaves as mulch as well.
Mm-hmm.
But they're shredded.
Oh yeah, she shreds them. Yeah, leaves do really well as mulch. Like a lot of people will take the leaves from their lawn and spread them over their garden in the winter. That's what we've done in the front garden for a long time. But yeah, leaves are a great mulch. They're a great source of nitrogen as well as they decompose. Any green growth is really good for nitrogen. But yeah, you can definitely use leaves as mulch.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Go ahead, Jane. Sorry.
Keep going. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, so I just had a little picture here of kind of diverse landscape, just to go over a few examples. Just ignore the words, they're not relevant. But in the context of using the given landscape, you can see over to the left there's a forested land. So maybe you want to plant some more trees, plant fruit trees, or plant kind of a shade plants around it, rather than chopping that forest down and kind of plowing it over, making a big sunny field out of it, using that forest to your advantage. Same goes with the pasture. If you notice that there's a good stretch of grassland, this is more for a bigger area, but if you notice there's a big stretch of grassland, keep it as grassland. Maybe have some animals graze on it, or grow kind of wheat-like things, stuff like that. And then this here, I wanted to include a natural slope can be very helpful, actually. Water tends to pool at the bottom of slopes, and then it tends to be quite dry along the sides. So during or on that downward slope, erosion tends to happen. So if you have plants that have a really strong root system, you can stick them on the sloping. And then if you have sort of wetland plants, you can kind of plant those around the base or at the base of the slope and use that environment to your advantage. Again, a wetland, or even if you wanted to capture the water from the flowing stream there, that's a really good source of energy, a good source of water. And then lastly, if you notice there's a really rich area of soil, you can plant heavy feeders. So for example, in terms of annuals, I know that squashes are very heavy feeders. If you notice there's a really good healthy patch of soil, you can plant squash there and just naturally have it grow on its own.
So it's just basically living in harmony with your environment.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what it values, really. That's kind of a main principle of permaculture, is trying not to disturb things and sort of add to what's already there.
Perfect.
Yeah. And then I talked a little bit about this last time, so valuing diversity. Diversity is very important. It reduces vulnerability, increases resilience. and increases the interaction between species. So the example I gave last time was a forest setting. So say a type of fungus came and wiped out all of the oak trees in the forest. That forest would still be fully functioning without them, because there's so much diversity and all of these different species have created their little relationships. It still leaves a very healthy ecosystem. So it's a very resilient ecosystem. And so variety also exists. It exists in different species, but you can also look at it in terms of variety in height or size. So really filling up a space with different heights, different widths. It also exists in bloom color. So different pollinators tend to be attracted to different bloom colors, as well as bloom time. So having something blooming all the time will constantly attract pollinators. It will also stagger the harvest time. So if you are running a little patch in your garden for annual vegetables, you want to have things that mature at different times. So one, you have produce all season long, but two, it also reduces labor. So rather than having one giant harvest time at the end of the season, you can kind of harvest throughout the season. So variety exists in many different places, not just species types. So that's really important to keep in mind. And so this here is a little diagram of food forests that I used in another presentation. Actually, I thought it was a really good picture. But food forests are essentially permaculture establishments. It's really mostly the same thing. But it shows you how you can use variety in plant species and in terms of height and width to really fill in and maximize the efficiency of the space. I find it really cool that they integrate kind of vining plants that grow up the trees. So that forms a relationship there, utilizes space, as well as the root layer and the ground cover layer. So it's really interesting that they have the entire floor covered in plant material rather than open soil. So that really utilizes that space to its full capacity. Same with the root layer. So it's really using the soil space to accumulate biomass and yield really for you later on.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. I've seen that in a few papers that I've looked at now about food forests.
I wonder if everyone knows there's the there's high bush cranberries, but there's also high bush blueberries, right?
Oh yeah. I've read that on a tag. I've seen it before.
Yeah.
And I know that there are blueberries that get quite tall. I'm not too familiar with the high bush blueberries, but yeah, there's tons of variety.
Can I just ask a question about the vine layer?
Of course, yeah.
We keep hearing about the Virginia creeper, and I don't know if it's killing trees or but I just wondered about this vine. It doesn't seem natural.
No, it's almost, I think it's considered or should be considered an invasive species at this point. It's a very aggressive vine. So not all vines will kill trees. Not all vines will be that vigorous. What Virginia creeper does is it grows extremely quickly and it kind of chokes out the tree, or it can, depending on how mature it is. I have it growing all over the back of my yard. It just grows wild. But yeah, it's a very aggressive vine. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you're not planting something like that, and especially like a newly established food forest, because it will probably choke out the tree. It'll grow much faster. So you can have species that are a lot more aggressive, but there are also some that are a little bit more manageable or just less aggressive overall. But yeah, Virginia creeper is a tricky vine. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
And
you.
I think if it's growing on a building, it's not good for the building either, your bricks or.
Yeah, it will seep into like siding. It will get into your siding. It also will hold moisture because of how dense it is, which also isn't good for siding. I don't know too much about how it affects brickwork, but it is like, if you look at it, you can see they add little spindly things and they stick onto the brick. So it's very intense for lack of better words. But yeah, it's a very aggressive vine. You got to kind of keep an eye out for
I
that.
find mine likes to be a home for earwigs also.
Oh,
Earwigs
okay.
are, and with all this moisture we've been getting,
Mhm.
they're just hanging out there and multiplying ferociously.
Mm. Yes, well, it does hold on to moisture, so I'm sure they would love that.
Nice little
It's a
habitat.
Yeah, exactly, for sure. I don't know how to permanently get rid of that. I don't think you really can without getting rid of the vine just because of the moisture, but um, yeah, even trimming it back is difficult. It's a tricky vine to kind of control.
And it is growing wild all over the place.
Yeah, I see it all over the place.
Yeah.
It likes it here. So maybe leave that out of your garden. Maybe try a different vine. Okay, I just have one more little point here. So reaction to change is probably the most important concept. Permaculture is a constantly evolving system, especially as plants mature. So for example, as a tree matures, it will cause more shade or cast more shade onto the ground. Your plants might not be happy. You kind of have to take that into account year by year. As well, some years you might have a different insect, some years might be hotter, your water sources might change. So it's really important to be observant. So observe and interact with the ecosystem, watch how it changes, sort of move things around, see how they do, and do that over time. So you can really watch the garden change, and then you'll be able to respond accordingly. So if you kind of step back and watch it do its thing and accept the feedback, you can use that feedback to respond to that change and kind of implement different techniques, so different insect management techniques, or where you put certain plants, just small things like that. But it's really important to observe and just keep an eye on what's going on, and maybe not act right away so that you can make a good decision.
That's really interesting because when you're saying that, I'm thinking about how complex our bodies are.
Yep.
And how, if you have an ingrown toenail, it could really ruin your life for a few weeks. But
Yeah.
But we forget that nature is complex as well. And there's all these things going on within the body of nature that are just amazing.
Yeah, it really is an interesting process to watch. And like you said, sometimes it goes away within a couple of weeks. Like sometimes plants will take a second to go into shock, and then they'll kind of kick back and come back from that little, say, bug attack somewhere. So yeah, it's really important to just kind of watch them do their thing and then act if it really is destroying it, rather than just act right off the bat. But yeah, it's like one giant science experiment.
Yeah, and the example is they're still selling it on the market. It's a poison. What's it called? It's an insecticide. It's still available, but they have it locked up in the hardware stores.
Oh, Roundup?
Roundup.
Yeah.
Roundup does destroy weeds, but it also destroys every microorganism in the soil.
Yeah, Roundup it's awful. I really don't like Roundup, and it's used a lot more than people think. I didn't know this until I actually got into the courses in class. But most GMO food products, it's not the GMO part that's dangerous. It's the fact that they are being genetically modified so that farmers can spray their entire field with Roundup, and those plants are resistant to Roundup. So there's Roundup being sprayed all over the place. And it's not the fact that the organism is modified, it's the fact that there's Roundup going all over the place because they're Roundup resistant. It's a terrible chemical. It's really not good. It's not good for the soil. It's not good for the people spraying it. It's not good for really, I mean, I don't know how much is left on the food, but I'm sure there's got to be something left on there. But yeah, it's very widely used, and it's kind of scary seeing it locked up in a hardware store and then knowing that's what's being sprayed on half your food. So yeah, it's
I guess that's why we go to the local farmers market, right?
yeah, it's very important. That's one of the reasons for sure.
Container gardening. This is, I'm interested. We have lots of people that have, or members that live in condos or in an apartment. So
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see what you have to say about container gardening.
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up actually. Because yeah, a lot of people don't have the space to have a big garden in your backyard, which is totally fine. But yeah, I'll just go over this quickly. So this picture actually is from a YouTube channel that I've watched a few times. It's called Her 86 Square Meters. I'm not too sure her name, but she has this garden in her apartment. There's a link there. I can email it to Harriet, but her garden is gorgeous. If you ever want to go check it out, they're really nice videos as well. But yeah, this is an example of what you can do with container gardening, maybe years down the road. It doesn't have to be like this right off the bat. But container gardening basically encompasses gardening in pots or whatever type of container. So it's a contained space. It's very flexible. But I'll just go over a few ways that you can integrate the permaculture concepts that I just talked about into your container gardening, because it's not just exclusive to a full-size garden. So companion planting, I don't know if you guys have heard of companion planting before, but it's a really neat concept. It's not too much backed by science quite yet, but it's backed more by years of experience. So it's a concept that involves planting certain species alongside others to encourage their growth and interaction. So certain interactions will help attract pollinators so that they'll pollinate other flowers and they kind of feed off each other like that. Or nutrient availability. If you've heard of nitrogen fixation, some plants can evolve a relationship with bacteria who can take the nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil in simple terms, so that it's available to other plants. So that's a really interesting companion planting relationship that you can kind of use to your advantage, as well as insect repellents. As you can see here, nasturtiums and marigolds are the two brightly flowered or brightly colored flowers. They're known to repel insects from plants, and they're often planted around other plants. So you can use that in pots as well, just like this.
The nasturtiums are very tasty, by the way.
Yes, I've heard that they're very good in salads. Yeah.
They're peppery. They're very
Mhm.
peppery tasting, and they pop when you just pick a bloom and put it in your mouth, and it's lovely.
Oh, you open the, oh, okay, I see. Yeah, I've heard of them being used in food before. I've never tried it myself, but yeah, and another advantage. There you go. They're a multi-purpose plant.
Mhm.
But yeah, so you can kind of mimic this in pots by planting multiple species in a pot, like you can see in these pots here. You can do it with all sorts of plants like herbs. Lettuces do well with some things. I won't really get into too much like specifics, but you can look it up. It's all over the internet. It's very easy to find. But you can also do it kind of like this. So you have all of the same type of plant in one pot. You just kind of put them close together. And it does do very similar things. The only thing it might not help with is the nitrogen fixation because they're not in the same soil, but it will help with other like pollinator things, as well as the insect repellent sort of interactions.
So the big pots that you showed us, that's almost like permaculture in a way.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm.
just bring it all together.
Yeah, exactly,
The
exactly.
one thing I found with, I have quite a few gardens here in my
Mhm.
home, but I'm finding that I can't eat everything that I have.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I figured that out
so I
last
need to
year.
I need to scale it down a little bit because uh, I find like, I was just looking at that great big pot and thinking, that's big enough.
Oh yeah.
I
Yeah,
can do
exactly.
that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a very accessible thing. So, yeah, even if you just have a small balcony, one pot exactly will last you quite a long time. Um, but yeah, especially like this, it helps to have like multiple things. It's very accessible. Um,
Okay.
this is an example as well. It's a very, very old technique. It's called the Three Sisters. So it uses corn, beans, and squash. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but I thought it was very interesting. So each component has its own use, and you get a yield from each component. So the squash is used as support for the climbing beans. And the beans will provide nitrogen to the soil. They're nitrogen fixers. And then the squash covers the ground, so it shades out all of the weeds. So it's a very well-functioning system, and you'll get yield from all three plants. This might not be ideal for containers, but it is an example of companion planting that I thought would be worth putting in.
I have a question about fertilizing when you've got multiple plants in there. And the soil, like if you use the soil from year to year, can you, like, would you put some fertilizer or manure or something in there in the fall before and let it sit? Like, how would you maintain the integrity of the soil without
Yeah.
changing it?
Okay. Yeah. So if you're going to use the same soil, there's two things that you really want to consider. You are going to want to fertilize it. So every year, at least once a year, add in some fertilizer. So yeah, you could use manure. I'm going to go over a few examples of other fertilizers you can use. But really amend it with some sort of nutrients. I would say your best bet is to do it in the spring. Nitrogen leaches from the soil very easily. So if you put it in the fall and you're having water running through it constantly, you might lose most of that nitrogen. So do that in the spring, I would say. And then also one of the bigger things with using the same soil is weeds and pathogens, bugs kind of thing that overwinter in the soil. So if you had a plant that, let's say, had a fungus, like I said earlier, and you let that fungus, those spores kind of drop into the soil, that's when you kind of want to be careful. And I maybe wouldn't recommend using that same soil, especially if you're planting the same thing. If you wanted to try planting something different in there, sometimes that helps with resistance because not all plants are susceptible to the same thing. But really be careful for weeds and things like that when using the same soil over and over again. But other than that, you totally can use the same soil. I've done it multiple times. Best bet is to amend it and switch up the plants in the soil from year to year, but you could definitely can
And
use
maybe
that same soil.
change the soil every 2 or 3 years or
Yeah,
no? Yeah,
yeah, you
okay.
can do that if you want, or just add some new soil, kind of mix it up a little bit. If you notice it's getting low or really dry, you can add a little bit more. But yeah, just keep an eye on it. You definitely can use the same soil.
You add compost? Could you add leaf compost?
Yep, yep. You
Uh,
can add whatever types of nutrients you really want to.
yeah.
Yeah, and the plants will be a good teller as well. Like if you notice the plant is kind of yellowing, then you can add, nitrogen, stuff like that. But yeah, again, just be observant, watch what it does. The plant will tell you if there's something wrong. So,
Good thing.
but yeah, you can use your soil again for sure. All right. So on the topic of fertilizer, there's a few natural fertilizers that you can use, which probably a lot of you are really familiar with, but I'll go over them anyways. Like I said, it is really important to build the soil with natural fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers don't help feed soil organisms. So especially if you're using your containers year after year or in a garden bed, you want to feed those soil organisms. So worms, there's beneficial bacteria, lots of nematodes are actually beneficial. There's different types of them, but some of them are very beneficial. So you really want to feed those soil organisms to help increase the health of your plant. So you can definitely use manure as a really good source of fertilizer. It's high in nitrogen mostly, but there's a lot of other micronutrients in there. I use bone meal and blood meal quite often. They're a byproduct from the meat industry mostly. And what's really nice about them is that they can specifically target certain nutrients. So blood meal tends to be very high in nitrogen and very low in other nutrients. So in the spring, when you're looking for that green growth, you give it some blood meal, and then in the fall, you can hit it with bone meal, a high phosphorus that helps with blooms. So that kind of stuff you can buy from the store, and it helps kind of target specific nutrients while using a natural byproduct, eliminating waste, like I said, which is very important in permaculture. But yeah, that's a different alternative to fertilizer. You can also use coffee grinds, is a very high source of nitrogen. They're acidic as well. So if you have blueberries, I know that rhododendrons and azaleas tend to like acidic soil. Any plant that likes acidic soil will benefit from coffee grinds as well.
What about worm castings? Do you have any thoughts on worm castings?
I haven't used them myself, to be honest with you, but I have had excellent feedback from work. We had people coming in all season looking for worm castings because they said that it's one of the better things to use. I do need to look into it more, to be honest with you, because I haven't really been.
Not cheap. It's not cheap, but you don't need a lot around that plant, hey?
Yeah, that's what I've heard. But yeah, people are willing to pay the price. It's a lot more expensive than manure, but apparently it works very, very well.
Jane, is bone meal and blood meal, is that for vegetables and flowers or just flowers?
Yeah, you can use it on vegetables, flowers. I fertilize my trees with it. You can use it. It's really just an all-purpose source of nitrogen or phosphorus. We use bone meal a lot for transplanting as well at work. Phosphorus targets blooms, but also root development. So you can put that in the bottom of a hole and you're transplanting a shrub or even your vegetables. It helps establish roots. So you can use it for really anything, and it's food safe as well.
Okay, planting bulbs.
Yep.
So you said blood meal in the spring and bone meal in the fall?
Yeah, so you want to target green growth in the spring. So you really want the plant to establish a good canopy so that it can absorb as much sunlight as possible to get that energy to produce fruit in the midsummer. So blood meal is a really high nitrogen fertilizer. It helps with green growth. And then bone meal is high phosphorus, which helps with, like I said, blooms, which will then develop into fruit in the fall.
Is it too late to add blood meal now to our gardens?
Nope, you can add blood meal if you want. Yeah, I just put blood meal on last night.
You can't put bone meal now?
You can. You definitely can. If you have like a flowering plant that, or like say an annual, if you have a hanging basket and you want it to produce more flowers now, you can pour it in right now. Or if you're transplanting something right now, you can put bone meal in. If your plants are just like, say I have a tomato plant in my garden right now, I would probably hold off on the bone meal for a little while. Give it some blood meal, let it get really nice and bushy and green, and then hit it with bone meal maybe in, I don't know, a few weeks. What day is it today? Is it still June? Yes, it's still June. Maybe wait a little while and then hit it with
The
bone
way
meal.
she said, is it still June?
Mary Lynn Santeri had a comment here. Her grandmother dumped all their pots in the fall, mixed it with the compost and leaf litter. That's what I've been doing too. The pile warmed in the spring, but she turned it, then she was ready to plant in the spring. She just filled her pots from the pile.
Yeah, that's a very good technique, actually. The heat of the kind of compost tends to kill a lot of weeds and pathogens. So it's a good way to kind of disinfect your old soil if it was infected previously, or just as like a backup or preventative measure. But yeah, that's a great idea. I'm sure it works quite well, actually.
Wonderful.
All right. Okay. I did just want to touch on one more thing. We kind of touched on that a bit earlier, so it's just very important to observe and watch what's going on, try different things. But I did just want to touch on perennials in containers because a lot of people ask me this at work. It is possible to grow perennials in containers. You really just have to be specific on what you're growing. So like you can see on the left here, there's a little tree growing in a pot. If you have a slow growing tree or something that you can manage, that's fine. It will do fine in a pot. Just make sure that you give it the right size of pot, or you increase the size nice and slowly, because it won't outgrow your pot quite as quickly as something like, say you put daylilies in a pot. Daylilies tend to spread, and so they'll tend to become root bound, which, as you can see on the right, in a pot much faster. So when a plant does this, it's really hard to provide nutrients to that plant because there's no soil to hold on to the nutrients. Same with water. So root bound plants tend to kind of die off, and that's why it's not really recommended to put perennials in containers. But there's ways you can get around it. So planting that really slow growing plant, increasing the pot size, really keeping an eye on the roots. Or if you get a plant that spreads, you want to split it every few years and keep it contained to that small space. And you can have it regrowing year after year. In terms of overwintering, it's a little bit trickier than having things overwinter in the ground. If you have a garage that doesn't get quite as cold, it might not freeze. That's a good space for it. If you can bury your pots in snow just to give them some insulation, that's really beneficial. Or even if you can dig a hole in the ground, stick your pot in the ground just for the winter, which isn't quite the most accessible thing to do, but if you can, it's very helpful. It just prevents the roots from freezing. What happens when roots freeze is they expand and sometimes can break as they thaw out, or even just as they're expanding, which really is harmful to the plant, especially if it happens to the crown. So that part that kind of sits right at the level of the soil, that's really what you want to avoid. So if you can try and insulate your pot or keep it a little bit warmer, that's the most ideal way to go about it. But you definitely can keep perennials in containers. It's just you have to keep an eye on them quite a bit more with the nutrients freezing and stuff like that. So yeah.
Wonderful.
That's what I've got for now. I had a couple people ask me if they wanted, or if they could see my garden. So I don't know if you want to get into questions first. We can do that after if we have time. Or if you just...
Oh, if you got pictures of your garden?
Yeah, I have a few
All right.
pictures.
Do we want to
Wanna
see
get-
it? I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I will start off with, it's been a little bit slow this year. I'm not too sure why, but things haven't quite shot up as much as they did last year. We also got the weeping tile done last summer, so that's why there's sand all over the place. But this is it here. So I have started putting perennials in my garden. On the left here, I have a perennial kiwi. It's a bit of an experiment. We'll see how that goes, but so far it's doing well. It's kind of crawling up the side of the fence there on the right.
Is it a tree or a vine?
It's a vine. So it should hopefully fill up that corner and keep coming back. But I'll have to let you know how it goes because I'm not too sure how well it's gonna go. And then on the right, I have some asparagus growing. I planted 2 crowns in there. A little bit late, I will admit, but they're coming up.
Is that in sun or what is it in?
Yeah, it's in most of the sun. Yeah, it gets the sun for most of the day. Both the asparagus and the kiwi. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it goes well. I love just this asparagus plant alone. So just seeing that one stalk is great. But then I've also added strawberries to the roof. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but there's 2 hanging baskets in the roof. So I've started some ever-bearing strawberries. They're starting to bloom now. I'm going to let them go to fruit. But yeah, I've started to put some perennials in there. I've tried a couple new things. We made a potato box this year, and the potatoes are doing a little bit too well. They're very fast, and they've kind of outgrown their space a lot faster than I thought. So we're trying to keep up on that. And then to the right, I have an amaranth plant. So amaranth is a grain sort of similar to quinoa. It's a red grain. The plant will get nice and big and then produce a little seed pods in the late summer. It's doing quite well. So I'm very excited about that. We also built a composting bin just behind the potatoes. So we're trying composting this year. So far it's going well. I'm gonna cross my fingers. But yeah, and then I'll be able to spread that on my garden, hopefully in the fall, if not next spring. Yeah, so I'm having a little bit of issues with insects this year. I don't know if anyone else has found this, but the slugs and caterpillars are quite bad this year. So all over my spinach, I've got the little slugs there, and there's caterpillars kind of eating things all over the place. So I'm gonna try and spray it with BTK. If you guys aren't familiar, it's a bacterial control. So the bacteria is kind of diluted in the liquid. You dilute it with water, you spray it on, and the bacteria targets a variety of insects. So it's a bit of a nicer way to control insects than a chemical. And I find it's a little bit more effective than the soap and water kind of technique. But yeah, we'll give that a shot, see how that goes. And then last year I spread my tomato droppings onto my garden, and all the seeds have decided to germinate. So I have a bunch of little baby tomatoes, as you can see on the right, kind of popping up all over the place. So that is one of the issues that you can keep in mind when spreading like dead plant matter on your garden, but it's a simple fix, just kind of yank them out. So those are a few of the issues that I've run into this year. And then as you can see, I do have straw all over surrounding the plants. I inoculated it with mushrooms this year to see if it would work. So as you can see on the right there, there's a little bit of that sawdust thing in my hand has mycelium in it, which is where the mushrooms come from. And then there's a little guy poking up. So they're trying. I don't expect to have any really good ones until later on in the season because they do need a bit of shade. But once the tomatoes kind of establish a little bit more, hopefully we'll see some coming up. But it's been a fun little experiment. There's some of them just kind of popping up out of nowhere. But yeah,
how do you inoculate? How do you inoculate the straw?
So you can get bags of mushroom, what's it called? The word is escaping me right now, but you can get, it's basically sawdust that the mycelium, so that little white stuff that you can see in the sawdust is kind of the main body of the mushroom. You can think of it as like the plant and its root systems, and then the mushrooms are the fruit. So you get a bag of sawdust and that mushroom body, the mycelium, and you just kind of crumble it up in between 2 layers of straw, and it will start to decompose and spread in the straw as it kind of
The name
takes
you
over.
want is spores.
Yes.
The
Yes, there's a bunch.
name you want is spores.
Yeah, it's mushroom spawn. Yeah, that's right. That's the word. Thank you.
Spores.
Yeah.
Spores.
Yeah, the spores are what come from the mushrooms, and like the chunk itself, like with the sawdust, I think they call spawn. But yeah, the spores are what create that mycelium. Yeah, you just kind of crumble it up and sprinkle it in the straw. But we'll see how it goes. It's very hot and sunny over top of it right now, so it's coming along. But yeah, there's little mushroom heads all over the place. And yeah, so that's how that's going. Hopefully it shoots up a little faster because they're a little bit tiny, but that is my garden. And if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead.
Any questions?
Yep. Is there any smell to blood meal and bone meal?
Any smell? Yeah, it does smell a little bit. You can smell it while you're spreading it on. I don't find it lasts very long though. It's mostly just when you open up the container and while you're spreading it. Once you put the container away, you water it a couple times, I find it's not very strong. I've used it inside before and it doesn't really tend to linger, but there is a bit of a smell to it when you open it up.
Would that keep squirrels away and
yeah, I've heard of people using blood meal to keep animals away. I don't know how well it works, to be honest with you, because my garden is fenced in. But people have come into Burroughs to buy blood meal for that exact reason. So it's definitely something you can try.
The only thing is my dog eats it.
Mm. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe be a little wary of that. My dog doesn't really go for it, but she's slowed down quite a bit. So
I've used blood meal in Rutherglen and it worked.
oh, okay.
Keep the chippies from eating stuff.
okay.
Yeah. That's
No, because they
usually
have dug out most of my plants already.
oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I can apply the blood meal now.
yeah, you can put blood meal on right now for sure.
And in the
See how
fall,
that
I do the
goes.
bone meal.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can maybe like midsummer, so mid-July, maybe you can put bone meal down if you have a fruiting plant. So if you have like a tomato or peppers, stuff like that, to get those the vegetables, I guess, growing. But yeah, you can put blood meal down right now.
Okay.
Jenny, can you close your screen and we'll open to full gallery?
Yep.
Thank
Can
you.
do that.
See if we have any more questions.
Hold on a second.
Okay.
I forget how to do this.
You should be at the bottom of your screen. It should say stop share. Oh,
There you go.
there we go.
Got it. There we go.
Yeah. Any more questions?
I have one. This is Barbara Mulder. I have just acquired a Myers lemon tree, and I was wondering, when I transplant it, should I put some bone meal in the bottom or blood meal, or just not worry about it?
Yeah, you can put both in. Don't put a ton in, maybe put the bone meal kind of around the roots is what we usually do when transplanting, but the bone meal will definitely help it kind of get adjusted to that pot. You can put blood meal in at the same time, or you can wait a little bit. It's really up to you, but it'll only be beneficial as long as you don't put too much.
Okay, and this is a Myers lemon tree. It's a little bit special. I know it needs lots of drainage.
For sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Any other questions? Janie, I just want to, I call you Janie, but
That's
Jane,
okay.
Jane, this has been invaluable. I really enjoyed this. It's a lot, you really, you're very good at this, and
Thank you.
I'd love to have you back again.
Yeah, for
See
sure.
a question in chat from Joan, and I have the same question.
Oh, do you work the blood meal into the soil or put it on the plant? No, you don't put it on the plant.
Yeah, you're gonna want to either just kind of spread it around the root of the plant, or you can work it into the soil. If you're transplanting, I've kind of mixed the blood meal and bone meal into the soil and then just plunk it in. But yeah, you can just spread it around the soil. You don't want to put it on the leaves or anything.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
So you can find Jane, if you want to ask more questions, go to Burroughs. That's
Yeah.
where it is. And are some of the products you mentioned today available at Burroughs?
Yeah, we have a lot of them. I get most of my, I got all my stuff there, to be honest.
All right.
But yeah.
And the straw included?
So the straw, we carry the straw in the fall. I think Kraus Feeds in Powassan possibly has straw. But I got my straw bale from my boyfriend's parents, who bought it in the fall, stored it in the winter, and I used it in the spring. So
and it's wonderful because it decomposes and makes more soil.
There you go.
That's the awesome thing about straw.
Yeah, it's a good natural mulch.
Sometimes it can house critters though, so you might want to be a little careful.
Yeah, I have a lot of spiders in my garden now.
Yeah, and they're good.
The spiders are good.
Jane, thank you so much. This has been great. I may talk to you again about maybe fall, but you're going to be off to school again?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm away for the month of August, but I'll be in Guelph in the fall by the 5th of September, ready to go. So if you want to have another talk, I should be able to squeeze that in for sure.
Awesome. We really enjoyed it. It's just
good. I'm glad.
I didn't get a contact number if I needed to get in touch with you, Jane.
Get in touch with me. I have an email address that I can give you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so it's Jane, JANE, CHIRICO, and then the number 14 @gmail.com.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I have it too, Gemma, if you need it.
Okay, thanks.
It doesn't work out for you. Jane, you may not be aware of this, but Clean Green Beautiful is running a neighborhood challenge right now, and it's green and beautiful. What are you